No one waiting in the lobby of Meridian Industrial Systems that Tuesday morning gave Calvin Rourke more than a passing glance. He sat in the last row of plastic chairs with a manila folder balanced on his knee, his work boots still slightly damp from the parking lot rain, and his jacket, the kind of faded that only came from years of actual use rather than years of storage. Around him, younger applicants in crisp button-downs scrolled their phones. The lobby itself was glass and steel and deliberately impressive, and Calvin had walked past it many times before. 14 years earlier, he had used the side entrance. The HR screening coordinator, a man named Derek Poole, called his name with the flat energy of someone who had already decided the outcome of the morning. He looked at Calvin's jacket, then at the application, then back at Calvin in a way that managed to convey all three observations as a single dismissal. "Maintenance technician," Derek said. "Night shift." "That's right," Calvin said. "There's a 14-year gap in your full-time employment history." "Contract work," Calvin said. "The references are all on page 2. Derek did not look at page 2. He asked whether Calvin was certain he could handle the physical demands of the position, the kind of question that had nothing to do with physical demands and everything to do with the fact that Calvin was 52 years old and had arrived without a digital portfolio or a recruiter's referral. When Calvin confirmed he could, Derek let the folder tip from his hands onto the floor, between them without making any move to pick it up. Calvin retrieved the pages himself, and while he was down on one knee, he noticed that the ambient ventilation panel behind Derek's desk was cycling unevenly, drawing and releasing at intervals that pointed to a pressure inconsistency 2 stages upstream. He said nothing about it. He restacked his papers, thanked Derek for his time, and returned to the last row of chairs. His application entered the company's internal routing system 40 minutes later. Under standard protocol, it would have been reviewed by a department head and returned to Derek within the hour. Instead, it stopped on the 36th floor, where a red border attached itself automatically to the name Calvin Rourke, accompanied by a single designation: restricted. Alicia Pemberton had been CEO of Meridian for exactly 7 months. She had inherited the chair from her father, Raymond Pemberton, who had founded the company 4 decades ago and died the previous winter without ever having fully let go of it. She had spent those 7 months trying to understand what she had actually inherited, not the legal structure, but the human architecture underneath it, the favors owed and the debts buried, and the quiet arrangements that made a company operate the way it actually operated rather than the way its org chart claimed. She was mid-meeting with Gerald Stafford, Meridian's chief operating officer, when her assistant set a tablet beside her with Calvin's name and the red border visible on the screen. Gerald Stafford had been the most senior voice at Meridian for 20 years. He spoke with the particular ease of a man who had survived every leadership transition by making himself appear indispensable to whoever occupied the chair above him. He was mid-sentence about third-quarter acquisition targets when Alicia turned the tablet fractionally away from his sightline and read Calvin Rourke's name 3 times. Her father had mentioned that name once near the very end. He had not explained it. He had simply said, "If this man ever comes back to Meridian, make sure you speak to him before Gerald does." Alicia had not understood it then. She had been managing her father's final months, fielding calls from the board, trying to prepare for a transition that arrived faster than she had expected. She had filed the instruction the way you filed things that came at the wrong moment. Carefully enough to find later, too carefully to examine right then. Gerald asked if there was an issue. Alicia said it was a routine staffing matter and excused herself briefly. She stepped into the adjacent office and asked her assistant which position Calvin Rourke had applied for. Night shift maintenance technician. She stood at the window for a moment with that answer. Then she called Derek Poole directly and told him, in a voice that left no room for interpretation, that Calvin Rourke was not to leave the building under any circumstances. Gerald was back at the conference table, reviewing margin projections when she returned. He watched her with the practiced attentiveness of a man who had spent 2 decades tracking small shifts in a chief executive's attention. He asked, very politely, whether everything was all right. Alicia said yes and asked him to continue. When the call came down to the lobby, Derek Poole's professionalism underwent a rapid adjustment. He approached Calvin with 2 security officers and announced in front of the other waiting applicants that his file had been flagged at the executive level. A statement he delivered in a tone that successfully implied Calvin had done something wrong without technically claiming it. He asked for the visitor badge and told Calvin the interview process would not be continuing. Calvin stood up, collected his folder for the 2nd time that morning, and asked whether this constituted Meridian's official response to his application. He said it the same way he said most things, quietly, without particular emphasis, in a voice that did not require the room's cooperation to stay level. Alicia's assistant arrived while Calvin was still standing at the security desk. The message was simple. The chief executive wanted to see him, directly, now. Derek did not recover gracefully. He suggested, to no one in particular, that the chief executive was likely going to question Calvin personally before reaching a decision, and that Calvin should be careful not to misrepresent his qualifications in front of her. Calvin did not respond to that either. In the elevator, riding up 36 floors, Alicia's assistant asked if Calvin had been to the executive level before. Calvin said this level hadn't existed the last time he worked here. The assistant absorbed that quietly for the remainder of the ride. Calvin observed, the buildings changes the way a person notes the changes in a house they once lived in. The repositioned security terminals, the upgraded access panels, the server infrastructure visible through the smoked glass of the data room. Meridian had grown, the bones were familiar. The skin was entirely new. Gerald Stafford was already in Alicia's office when the elevator opened. He had arrived before Calvin without being summoned, which told Calvin something. Gerald looked at the work jacket and the worn folder and the 14-year gap, and arranged his expression into something that approximated professional concern. "We need to be careful here," Gerald said to Alicia, as though Calvin were not standing in the doorway. This man left Meridian under significant circumstances. Circumstances the company has legal documentation to support. "Then let's talk about the documentation," Alicia said. She stood behind her desk and looked at Calvin directly. "My father left instructions," she said. "He mentioned your name once near the end. I didn't understand it at the time." Calvin told her he wasn't there about the past. He was there because he had relevant maintenance experience, was available for overnight hours, and needed a position with steady income and health coverage for himself and his son. Alicia asked why a man with his background, systems engineering, 14 years of contract work, would apply to check pressure gauges and replace failed components on the night shift. Calvin said that the industry had a long memory and that his name had been connected to the Harlow plant failure for 14 years in a way that made most firms unwilling to take a chance on him. He was not asking for sympathy. He was asking for a job evaluation. Gerald interrupted to describe the Harlow incident with practiced fluency. The equipment failure, the liability, the cost to the company, Calvin's unauthorized modifications to the control sequence. He spoke with the ease of a man who had told this version so many times it had become inseparable from memory. Calvin waited until he finished. Then he asked whether Gerald still had the original incident report, the unedited version, from the week it happened, before the legal department had reviewed it. Gerald said that report had been archived under standard retention policy. "Destroyed," Calvin said. Gerald repeated the word archived. "You're describing a protocol deviation based on a primary document that no longer exists," Calvin said. You're asking this room to take your word for what it said. Something changed in Alicia's expression. She offered Calvin a settlement figure to resolve the matter quietly. He declined. He said his silence had already been purchased once, 14 years ago, and he hadn't found the transaction particularly satisfying in retrospect. He asked instead to be evaluated on the same basis as any other applicant. Alicia placed him on a 30-day probationary period under Rosa Ibanez, the head of Meridian's night maintenance crew. Gerald objected sharply. A man with a history of unauthorized system interference, he said, should not be given building access under any circumstances. Alicia replied that maintenance staff worked under direct supervision, and every corridor was covered by camera, and that she was not in the habit of making personnel decisions based on Gerald's comfort level. Before leaving the room, Calvin glanced at a system status display on the far wall showing load distribution across the eastern generator cluster. He mentioned, in the same tone he had used for everything else, that the readings looked inconsistent with the ambient draw. Gerald said he hadn't even picked up a work order yet and was already practicing to be an engineer again. Calvin said the readings didn't know who was looking at them. Alicia walked him to the elevator herself. That night, the Eastern Generator Cluster triggered an automated maintenance alert. Rosa Ibanez had managed Meridian's night crew for 19 years. She had seen every variety of person pass through that team. The ones who treated the work as a temporary humiliation, the ones who lasted a week, and the rare ones who showed up and treated the building like something worth caring for. Calvin Rourke belonged to that last category from his very first shift. He arrived early. He started with the hardest tasks. He memorized the building's layout faster than any new hire she had ever trained, and he never once explained himself. Word of what had happened on the 36th floor traveled downward quickly, the way those things always did, and certain daytime staff began leaving messes behind him after he had finished cleaning a section, or making remarks just loud enough to carry across an open floor. Calvin did not respond to any of it. He simply noted which areas needed extra attention and continued. During his second week, running a routine check on the subfloor control room, Calvin found a thermal regulation component bearing a vendor code that should not have been there. Meridian had placed that vendor on a prohibited list 6 years earlier after a field failure in another facility. The part was new. Someone had ordered it recently and had it installed with legitimate-looking documentation. He cross-referenced 3 other areas over the following 2 nights and found the same pattern. Cheaper components installed at premium contract prices, all authorized under a maintenance agreement Gerald Stafford had signed 18 months earlier. He brought the finding to Rosa. She listened without interrupting, asked 2 questions, and kept a copy of his notes without mentioning she had done so. Alicia had been reviewing the maintenance floor security footage late at night without informing Gerald she was doing so. She watched Calvin check panels no one had asked him to check, photograph serial numbers with the methodical patience of a man building a record he wasn't certain anyone would ever see, and complete every assigned task first, before moving on to what he had actually found. She pulled her father's private files the same evening and found, in a sealed inner envelope, a co-invention agreement signed by Raymond Pemberton and Calvin Rourke, dated 16 years ago, 2 years before the Harlow incident. The agreement granted Calvin perpetual technical authorship credit and a royalty share on any commercial deployment of the MESA protocol. Meridian's emergency safety architecture, the coordinated safety response system that ran across all 12 of the company's active facilities. The MESA protocol was still running. It had run continuously since the day Calvin built it. He had never received $1 of the agreed compensation. Beneath the agreement, in her father's handwriting on a folded notacard, Gerald convinced me to bury this. I told myself it was protecting the company. I was protecting myself. I was wrong. The crisis arrived on a Wednesday, During a board session where Gerald was presenting the case for an acquisition that would restructure Meridian's operational holdings and buried 16 pages into the agreement's technical appendix, terminate all pre-existing technical authorship arrangements under the acquiring entity's new intellectual property framework. Calvin was running a cable check outside the server room corridor when he identified the failure signature. 3 components in the primary MESA relay had dropped below operational threshold simultaneously. He had seen that exact combination of readings once before, at Harlow, in the hours before everything came apart. He did not run. He walked directly to Rosa, told her what he had found, and asked her to radio the building operations center. Then he asked to speak to the chief executive. Gerald, informed of the request mid-presentation, told the board it was a disgruntled maintenance worker attempting to manufacture a distraction. Alicia left the meeting. Calvin stood in the corridor outside the boardroom in his work uniform and told Alicia that the primary MESA relay was failing across 3 nodes. If the cascade continued unchecked, every active safety system in the building would switch it to backup simultaneously, and the handoff sequence had a 14-second gap that would leave the server room without protection. He estimated 11 minutes before the first node hit critical threshold. Gerald stepped into the corridor and said loudly that they were watching a man in a maintenance uniform invent an emergency to delay a vote. Alicia authorized emergency technical access without hesitation. Calvin did not act alone. He sent Rosa to coordinate the physical isolation of the failing relay on sub-level 2. He directed the operations team to hold the backup sequence manually at stage 2 rather than allowing it to advance. He pulled a junior technician named Marcus Teal alongside him and gave him specific, ordered instructions for the secondary relay room, which connection, which sequence, which order, speaking steadily even while moving, because panic was a contagion, and the only reliable counter to it was precision. Gerald remained in the hallway and told the board members who had followed that what they were watching was a man who mopped floors performing for an audience. With 3 minutes remaining, Calvin reached the relay room. The 3rd node was drawing heat it couldn't sustain. He isolated it by hand, using a contingency procedure he had written into the original MESA documentation. A recovery approach he had built into the system years ago for exactly this class of failure, and rerouted the load through a secondary pathway that had existed in the architecture since he first designed it, never fully understood by anyone who came after him, and therefore never removed. The building lights flickered once. The server room stayed online. The activity logs, automatically preserved by the systems Calvin had just stabilized, showed that the failing components had been installed under Gerald Stafford's maintenance contracts. They also showed that Gerald's executive credentials had been used to suppress 3 automated warning alerts about those same components over the preceding 8 weeks. When Calvin returned to the boardroom, Rosa Ibanez was already there with a storage box she had retrieved from a sealed room on the basement level, sealed for 11 years. Inside were the original MESA design documents in Calvin's handwriting, the counterpart copy of the co-invention agreement, and the unedited Harlow incident report. That report showed clearly that the failure had originated in components Gerald had authorized for cost reduction without notifying engineering, and that Calvin had manually extended the plant's operational life by 7 hours through improvised emergency procedures, giving the company time to execute a controlled shutdown that prevented a significantly worse outcome. It also showed that Calvin had been the one to write the incident summary, recommending his own removal in exchange for the protection of his team's jobs. He had believed, at the time, that it was the only bargain available to him. The board heard all of it. Alicia read her father's letter aloud. The independent auditors she had retained quietly over the preceding 3 weeks laid out the maintenance contract irregularities invoice by invoice, each discrepancy small enough to dismiss in isolation and impossible to ignore laid side by side across 30 months of spending. Gerald attempted to redirect the conversation 4 times and failed each time because the documents did not require his interpretation to be understood. He was escorted from the building by internal security, not through confrontation, but through the specific, airless silence of people who had deferred to someone for a long time and had stopped. As he passed Calvin in the corridor, Gerald said that he was still just a technician who had talked his way into the building. Calvin said that was exactly right, and that it was exactly what had allowed him to see what no one on the upper floors had been willing to look at. Alicia asked Calvin that evening whether he intended to use the co-invention agreement to block the acquisition entirely. Calvin said the acquisition had no bearing on what he was about to say. He had 3 conditions before any restructuring conversation could move forward. Gerald Stafford would step down from all roles for the duration of the investigation. Meridian would issue a formal industry correction to the employment record that had followed Calvin's name for 14 years, and would extend the same correction to 2 other engineers whose records had been tainted by the same narrative. And the company would establish a formal safety reporting channel for maintenance and operations staff, independent of the management chain, so that the next person who found something wrong would have a path to say so before it became a catastrophe. The board accepted all 3 without debate. Alicia offered him the role of Director of Technical Integrity, a position she said she had intended to create since her 3rd week in the chair and had simply not yet found the right person for. Calvin asked whether he could finish the shift he had started. She found him at 20 minutes to midnight, buffing the lobby floor, the same floor where Derek Poole had let his papers fall that Tuesday morning. She asked why he was still here, now that it clearly wasn't required of him. He told her the floor didn't know what had happened in the boardroom, and neither did the people who would walk across it tomorrow morning. It needed the same care it always had, regardless of what he was being paid to provide it. Alicia bent down and picked up a paper coffee cup someone had left near the revolving door and put it in the trash can by the entrance. It was a small gesture, and it was unremarkable, and Calvin noticed it anyway, because the small gestures were usually the ones that turned out to mean something. His son, Ethan, was 13 years old and had been telling his classmates since October that his father worked nights keeping a large building running. He said it the same way he said most things, without apology, with a directness that Calvin had recognized in him since he was very small, a quality that seemed to have arrived fully formed rather than learned. At a quiet internal ceremony 6 months later, honoring Meridian's maintenance and operations staff for their contribution to the company's safety record, Ethan sat in the front row beside Rosa Ibanez and watched his father speak from a modest podium at the front of a conference room that held perhaps 60 people. Calvin thanked Rosa first, by full name. Then he named 4 other members of the night crew individually. He asked that their names appear in the printed program rather than his photograph on the cover. He said the only thing he had learned with any certainty in 14 years was that the people who kept a building standing after midnight understood more about what that building actually needed than anyone who had locked it up at 6 in the evening and returned to it in the daylight. He said that had always been true. He said it would remain true long after everyone in this room had moved on to whatever came next. Ethan did not fully understand all of it yet, but he understood enough to know that his father had walked into a building where no one was paying attention to him and had done the work anyway, every night, until the work itself made the building turn around and look back. That, Calvin Rourke had always believed, was the only kind of standing that lasted.